The rain came down in sheets, a relentless curtain that blurred the neon glow of Chicago's Magnificent Mile into a watercolor smear of light and shadow. It was October 2025, and the city was caught in the grip of a late autumn storm, the kind that turned the streets into rivers and sent pedestrians scurrying under awnings, their umbrellas buckling under the wind's assault. Nestled on a quieter corner of this glittering stretch, where the clamor of tourists gave way to an enclave of old-world elegance, stood the Crimson Orchid, a restaurant that was less a dining establishment and more a sanctuary for the city's elite. Its facade was unassuming red brick ivy creeping up the walls. A single brass lantern flickering above a heavy mahogany door, but inside it was a world of muted opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast soft prisms across burgundy velvet drapes, and the air carried the rich scent of aged whiskey, seared steak, and secrets so potent they seemed to linger in the wood-paneled walls. The Crimson Orchid wasn't for the Instagram influencers or the new money tech bros who flaunted their wealth in gold chains and rented Lamborghinis. This was a haven for those whose power was measured in whispered deals, in names etched on the cornerstones of museums and skyscrapers, in fortunes so vast they didn't need to shout to be heard. At the heart of this carefully curated ecosystem moved Nora Kane, a 29-year-old bartender, whose presence was as unobtrusive as the rain tapping against the leaded glass windows. To the untrained eye, Nora was perfectly forgettable, medium height, dark hair pulled into a neat bun, her black uniform crisp but unremarkable. Her face was pleasant, but plain, her gray-green eyes downcast as she polished glasses or poured precise measures of liquor with a steady hand. She was the kind of person who faded into the background, and that was exactly how she wanted it. For 5 years, Nora had perfected the art of invisibility, her movements silent and efficient, her smile polite but distant. She refilled a patron's martini before they realized it was empty, anticipated a request for a rare bourbon with an almost eerie intuition, and cleared stray crumbs from a table before they could offend the meticulous sensibilities of the Crimson Orchid's clientele. To the staff, she was reliable. To the guests, she was a ghost. But beneath this carefully crafted veneer, Nora was a predator in waiting. Her senses attuned to every detail of the room. She didn't just see people, she dissected them. The hedge fund manager in the corner booth, Mr. Carver, always tugged at his cufflinks when he was bluffing about a deal. The heiress by the fireplace, Ms. Langston, sipped her wine too quickly when her companion mentioned her father's name. Nora catalogued these tells with the precision of a watchmaker, her mind a steel trap for the subtle cues of human behavior. It was a skill born not in hospitality training, but in a past she had buried deep, locked away behind the placid mask she wore each night. Around her wrist, hidden beneath the sleeve of her uniform, was a thin silver bracelet, its surface worn smooth from years of nervous habit. Engraved with a single word, control. It was the only relic of her former life, a tether to a time when observation wasn't a job skill, but a matter of survival. Nora had sworn never to be a victim again, a vow sealed in the ashes of a childhood marked by violence and loss. She had been 15 when her older brother Jamie was gunned down in a back alley in Englewood, a casualty of a gang dispute he had no part in. That loss had shattered her world. But it was Victor Lang, a soft-spoken philanthropist with a knack for finding broken kids, who had pieced her back together. He had pulled her into a self-defense program at a crumbling community center where a grizzled ex-Special Forces trainer named Sergeant Voss had taught her not just how to fight, but how to think, how to turn fear into fuel. Control the chaos. Nora Voss had growled his voice like gravel. Or it controls you. The bracelet was Victor's gift, a reminder of that lesson, and she never took it off. At 7:45 p.m., the bell above the Crimson Orchid's door chimed softly, a delicate sound that barely pierced the low hum of conversation and clinking glassware. Ethan Caldwell entered, and the room seemed to tilt ever so slightly, as if the laws of gravity had acknowledged his presence. As the CEO of Nexus Corp, a tech conglomerate that dominated everything from quantum computing to cybersecurity, Caldwell was a man who didn't just wield power, he was power. His net worth was a number so large it was abstract, a figure that could buy small countries or topple markets with a single email. At 42, he was tall with sharp cheekbones and a tailored navy suit that fit like a second skin. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and his hazel eyes carried a weight that no amount of wealth could erase. He came alone, as he always did on the third Wednesday of every month, his lack of security detail a source of quiet speculation among the staff. "Your usual table." Mr. Caldwell asked Maurice, the maitre d', his voice smooth as polished marble, his demeanor that of a man who had spent decades managing egos bigger than his own. Nora watched from behind the bar as Caldwell was led to table 12, a secluded corner framed by a stained glass partition depicting orchids in bloom. It was his late sister's favorite spot, a detail Nora had pieced together from the way his fingers lingered on the table's edge, his gaze fixed on the empty chair across from him. "Good evening, Mr. Caldwell," Nora said, approaching his table with a tray balanced effortlessly in one hand. "May I get at you something to start?" Her voice was a soft professional hum designed to be forgotten the moment it was heard. Caldwell didn't look up from the leather-bound menu, though Nora knew he'd order the same thing he always did. "A glass of the Pappy Van Winkle. 23-year neat," he said, his voice low and clipped, a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Of course," Nora replied, her tone unchanging. As she turned to leave, he spoke again, softer this time, a test wrapped in a question. "Miss Kane, is the duck confit as exceptional as it was last month?" Nora paused, her back still to him, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. It was a ritual of his, this probing, as if he were checking the world's pulse through her response. "Chef Moreau is at the top of her game tonight, sir," she said, turning to meet his gaze. "I'd say it's even better." His eyes, sharp and assessing, held hers for a moment, searching for a crack in her composure. Finding none, he gave a curt nod, a flicker of approval in his expression. "Very well." Nora retreated to the bar, her senses humming. Something felt off tonight, a dissonance in the air that she couldn't quite place. It wasn't Caldwell, he was as predictable as the storm outside his presence, a constant in the Crimson Orchid's rhythm. It was something else, a subtle shift in the room's energy, like the static before lightning. She dismissed it as the weather, the city's perpetual tension seeping through the walls. But her hand brushed the bracelet on her wrist, and the word control felt like a warning. At the bar, she poured the bourbon with mechanical precision, her reflection flickering in the mirrored backsplash. The woman looking back was a stranger, calm, composed, invisible. No one would guess the violence her hands were capable of, the memories that pulsed behind her steady gaze, a blood-soaked training mat, a knife pressed to her throat, in a test she barely survived. Sergeant Voss's voice, barking, again. The bracelet felt heavier tonight, a cold weight against her skin, as if it knew something she didn't. At 8:12 p.m., the bell above the door rang again, but this time it was different, sharp, urgent, like a blade slicing through silk. 4 men entered, their movements choreographed with a precision that set Nora's nerves on edge. They didn't arrive together, but in a staggered sequence, each man taking a position that turned the restaurant into a chessboard. The first, a wiry man in a charcoal suit, too practical for the Crimson Orchid's elegance, bypassed Maurice's podium without a glance, his eyes scanning the room like a predator mapping its territory. He stationed himself near the entrance, his back to the wall. His posture relaxed, but coiled. The second, broader, with a jaw like concrete, moved toward the hallway leading to the restrooms, his hand brushing the edge of his jacket, where a bulge betrayed a concealed weapon. The third and fourth men were larger still, their tailored jackets straining against body armor, their steps heavy with the confidence of men who knew violence intimately. One positioned himself near the bar, his gaze sweeping the room in a systematic arc, while the other took up a post by the kitchen doors, cutting off the staff's primary exit. The room's atmosphere shifted in an instant. Forks paused mid-air, conversations faltered, and the warm hum of conviviality evaporated, replaced by a cold, prickling fear. Maurice opened his mouth to protest, but a sharp glance from the man at the entrance silenced him. This wasn't a request, it was a takeover. Nora, polishing a highball glass behind the bar, didn't falter. Her hands kept moving the soft squeak of cloth on crystal, the only sound she allowed herself. But her mind was racing, processing the scene with a clarity that felt like ice water in her veins. This wasn't a robbery. Robbers were loud, sloppy, fixated on cash or jewelry. These men were silent, disciplined, their focus singular. Her eyes flicked from one to the next, mapping their positions, their earpieces, their weapons. They were forming a perimeter, a kill box, and at its center was Table 12. Ethan Caldwell. The fifth man entered at 8:15 p.m., and the air in the Crimson Orchid seemed to thicken as if his presence alone had altered its density. He was of medium height, with slicked-back blonde hair and eyes like polished obsidian, cold and unreadable. His bespoke suit, a deep forest green, was cut to perfection, but it was his movement that marked him as the leader, a languid, almost serpentine grace that screamed danger. Gabriel Voss, known in certain circles as the Wraith, a mercenary whose reputation for surgical precision in corporate extractions was the stuff of legend. His gaze locked onto Caldwell's table with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey, and a smile curved his lips sharp and cruel, never reaching his eyes. Nora's blood turned to frost. She recognized the formation: four corners, one. Commander, a textbook tactical setup for an extraction or assassination. She'd studied it in dog-eared manuals under Voss's tutelage in a life she'd spent years trying to erase. Her hand drifted to the bracelet, the word "control" burning against her skin. Voss glided toward Table 12, his leather shoes silent on the polished oak floor. The two larger men moved in sync, flanking him, their intent now terrifyingly clear. Caldwell, watching the scene unfold in the reflection of his bourbon glass, didn't flinch. His face was a mask of weary resignation, as if he'd been expecting this moment. "Voss," he said, as the man reached his table, his voice dripping with disdain. "I should have known Lang would send his pet snake." Voss's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Mr. Caldwell, my employer, Mr. Lang feels your last discussion was incomplete. He'd like a private audience. No distractions." He gestured lazily to the room, and one of the larger men pulled a suppressed pistol from his jacket. Its presence, a silent scream. A woman at a nearby table stifled a gasp. Phones on the tables now, the man by the bar barked, his voice a low growl. Slowly, shakily, patrons complied, their devices clattering onto white linen. Nora's mind was a supercomputer calculating angles, threats, and opportunities. Kitchen blocked entrance controlled two heavies, two scouts, one leader. Objective: extraction, not assassination, Otherwise, Caldwell would be dead already. Her eyes caught a flicker of movement in the crowd. A young woman barely 20 huddled in a corner booth, her hands trembling as she clutched her napkin. The sight hit Nora like a punch, a mirror of herself at that age, terrified and helpless. Something shifted inside her, a spark of purpose beyond survival. She set the glass down with a soft, deliberate clink, the sound cutting through the silence like a gunshot. The man by the bar turned toward her, his brow furrowing in annoyance. In that split second, Nora Kane, the bartender, vanished. In her place stood a weapon forged in pain, honed by discipline, and ready to unleash a storm of her own. The Crimson Orchid had transformed in an instant from a bastion of refined elegance to a battlefield teetering on the edge of anarchy. The rain outside hammered against the shattered leaded glass windows, its rhythm a frantic counterpoint to the stifled gasps and trembling hands of the patrons. The air was thick with the acrid tang of fear, mingling with the fading scents of roasted pheasant and aged oak. The four intruders had locked the room in a chokehold of control. Their positions a deadly geometry, one at the entrance, one by the restrooms, one near the bar, and one blocking the kitchen doors. Gabriel Voss, the Wraith, stood at the epicenter, his predatory gaze fixed on Ethan Caldwell, who sat unflinching at table 12, his bourbon glass reflecting the chaos like a crystal ball. The suppressed pistol in the hand of the enforcer by the bar was a silent threat, its barrel catching the dim light of the chandeliers. The young woman in the corner booth, her face pale and eyes wide with terror, clutched her napkin as if it could shield her from the nightmare unfolding. Nora Kane behind the bar was no longer the invisible bartender. Her gray-green eyes burned with a cold, lethal clarity, her body coiled like a spring under pressure. The silver bracelet on her wrist engraved with control felt like a pulse against her skin, a reminder of the lessons that had kept her alive through a past she'd buried but could never outrun. Nora's mind was a storm of calculations mapping the room with the precision of a tactician. The man by the bar, call him Alpha, was the immediate threat, his position giving him a clear line of sight to most of the room. The one by the kitchen, Bravo, was cutting off the staff's escape. The scout by the restrooms, Charlie, was watching the perimeter, while the one at the entrance, Delta, was the gatekeeper. Voss, the leader, was the wild card, his movements too fluid, too unpredictable. This wasn't a smash and grab. It was a surgical strike, and their target was Caldwell, or more precisely, the Eclipse Key. He carried a device Nora had overheard whispers about in the staff room, a piece of tech that could crack the world's digital infrastructure like an egg. Her hand rested on the bar, inches from a heavy crystal decanter of cognac, its weight a potential weapon. She didn't move yet, didn't betray the shift in her demeanor. To the men, she was still scenery, a non-threat, in a crisp black uniform. That was their first mistake. At 8:17 p.m., Voss leaned closer to Caldwell, his voice a low, venomous purr. The Eclipse Key. Ethan, hand it over and we walk out quietly. Refuse, and this lovely establishment gets a new paint job red. Caldwell's jaw tightened, but his eyes didn't waver. You think Victor Lang can intimidate me with his errand boy? He said, his tone laced with contempt. You're out of your depth, Gabriel. Voss's smile sharpened a blade unsheathed. Depth is my specialty, Mr. Caldwell. You'd be surprised how deep I can cut. The enforcer by the bar. Alpha shifted his weight, his pistol twitching as if eager to speak. The room held its breath, the patrons frozen, their wealth and status useless against the raw threat of violence. Nora's gaze flicked to the young woman in the corner, her trembling hands now knotted in her lap, her eyes pleading for someone to make this stop. The sight ignited something in Nora, a memory of herself at 15, cowering in a community center bathroom while gunshots echoed outside. Victor Lang had pulled her from that darkness, but now his shadow was cast over this room, his hand guiding the men who threatened it. The contradiction clawed at her, but she pushed it down. Control the chaos, she thought Voss's old mantra echoing in her skull. She moved. It wasn't a conscious decision, but an instinct honed by years of brutal training under Sergeant Voss. Not Gabriel, but the man who'd shaped her, the one who'd taught her to turn fear into a blade. Her hand closed around the cognac decanter, its weight reassuring, and in a single fluid motion, she vaulted the bar. Not with the showy grace of an acrobat, but with the raw efficiency of a predator. Alpha, the enforcer, caught the movement too late, his head turning just as Nora closed the distance. She didn't aim for his gun, that was a rookie mistake. She swung the decanter in a vicious arc, the heavy crystal connecting with his temple with a sickening crunch. The impact didn't shatter the glass, but sent a shockwave through his skull. His eyes rolled back and the 240-pound man crumpled to the floor, his pistol clattering against the polished oak. A collective gasp ripped through the room, a sound of pure shock that shattered the silence. Voss froze mid-sentence, his head snapping toward the bar. "What the he?" hissed, his composure cracking for the first time. Nora didn't stop. She kicked a heavy bar stool, sending it skidding across the floor toward Bravo the enforcer by the kitchen. He sidestepped instinctively, his balance shifting for a critical half-second. It was enough. Nora dove low, staying below his line of fire, and rolled behind a table using it as cover. Bravo's pistol barked a suppressed crack that splintered the table's edge, sending wood chips flying. A woman screamed, the sound raw and primal. Nora's heart was a jackhammer, but her mind was ice. She grabbed a silver serving tray from the floor, its surface gleaming like a shield, and hurled it like a frisbee at Bravo's knees. He grunted, stumbling, his aim wavering. Nora was already moving, closing the distance in a blur. She didn't fight his gun, she fought his body. Her shoulder drove into his midsection, using his own momentum to send him crashing into the kitchen doors. The doors swung inward, and she followed, slamming them shut behind her. Inside the kitchen, the air was hot and sharp, with the smell of sizzling garlic and fear. The staff, 2 line cooks, a sous chef, and a dishwasher, were huddled against a stainless steel counter, their eyes wide with panic. Out the back now, Nora barked, her voice no longer the soft murmur of a bartender, but a command that cut through the chaos. The dishwasher fumbled with the lock on the heavy steel door leading to the alley, his hands shaking. Nora scanned the kitchen, her eyes landing on a rack of knives. She didn't take one too obvious, too messy. Instead, she grabbed a cast-iron skillet still warm from searing scallops, its handle wrapped in a towel. Bravo kicked the kitchen doors open, his pistol raised, his face a mask of fury. "You're dead, bitch," he roared, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. Nora didn't flinch. She threw the skillet not at his head, but at his gun hand. The heavy iron struck his wrist with a crack, and he howled, the pistol dropping to the floor. She was on him before he could recover, her knee driving into his groin, her elbow slamming into his throat. He gagged, his massive frame folding like paper, and she swept his legs, sending him crashing to the tiles. His head hit the edge of a prep table with a dull thud, and he went still. 2 down. The kitchen staff scrambled out the back door, their footsteps fading into the rain-soaked alley. Nora scooped up Bravo's pistol, a Beretta M9 suppressor attached, and checked the magazine. Nearly full. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of a life she'd tried to forget, the weight of the gun familiar, almost comforting. She crouched by the kitchen doors, listening. The dining room was a cacophony of muffled sobs and Voss's sharp commands. Find her. He snapped his voice tight with rage. She's one woman, not a goddamn army. Nora's lips twitched in a grim smile. One woman was enough. She peeked through the crack in the doors, assessing. Charlie the scout, by the restrooms, was moving cautiously toward the kitchen, his pistol low but ready. Delta at the entrance was holding position, his eyes darting between the room and the street outside. Voss was still at Caldwell's table, one hand gripping the billionaire's shoulder, the other holding a sleek Glock aimed at his chest. Caldwell's face was unreadable, but his eyes flicked toward the kitchen, as if he sensed her presence. Nora's mind raced. She couldn't take them all at once, not without risking the patrons. Her eyes caught the young woman again, now huddled under her table, her face streaked with tears. Nora's chest tightened. She saw herself in that girl, the fear, the helplessness. Victor Lang's face flashed in her memory. His kind eyes, his steady voice telling her she was stronger than her pain. But Lang had sent these men. The bracelet on her wrist felt like a shackle, now its promise of control mocking her. She pushed the thought away. Focus, survive, protect. She spotted a fire alarm panel on the kitchen wall, its red lever tempting. A distraction, but too loud, too chaotic. It would bring the police faster, but also risk a panicked stampede. Instead, she grabbed a bottle of high-proof vodka from a shelf, unscrewed the cap, and tore a strip of cloth from a discarded apron. A Molotov cocktail was crude but effective. She cracked the kitchen door open just enough to see Charlie approaching. He was 10 feet away, his movements jerky out of his depth in close quarters. Nora lit the cloth with a lighter from the counter, the flame catching instantly. She hurled the bottle not at Charlie, but at the floor near his feet. It shattered, the vodka igniting in a whoosh of flame that spread across the oak. Charlie yelped, stumbling back, his focus broken. Nora burst through the doors, staying low, the Beretta in a two-handed grip. She didn't aim for his chest, too lethal. Instead, she fired a single shot at his thigh. The suppressed round hit with a dull thump, and Charlie collapsed, clutching his leg, his gun skittering away. 3 down. The patrons screamed, diving under tables, the fire spreading along the floor, licking at the velvet drapes. The sprinklers kicked in, dousing the room in a cold rain, adding to the chaos. Voss spun toward her, his Glock still on Caldwell. Enough, he roared, his composure gone, his blonde hair plastered to his forehead by the sprinklers. Drop it, or he dies. Nora stood 20 feet away. The Beretta steady her stance, textbook, perfect. Water dripped from her hair, but her eyes were unyielding. You're losing Gabriel, she said, her voice calm, cutting through the panic. Walk away. You and your last man get to live. Voss laughed, a harsh, grating sound. You think you're some kind of hero bartender, I know who you are. Nora Kane Lang's little project. He trained you, didn't he? And now you're betraying him for this corporate leech. The words hit harder than any bullet, a knife twisting in her gut. Lang's name, spoken like a weapon, brought a flood of memories, his hand on her shoulder, his promise that she could be more than her past. But she saw the young woman under the table, the terror in her eyes, and her resolve hardened. This isn't about him, she said. It's about them. She nodded toward the patrons. Let Caldwell go. This ends now. Voss's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. He knew her, or thought he did. They'd trained under the same man years apart, 2 weapons forged in the same fire. But Nora was something else now, something he couldn't predict. He tightened his grip on Caldwell, the Glock, pressing into the billionaire's temple. The Eclipse key, he said, his voice low and dangerous. He has it. Give it to me, and I walk. No one else gets hurt. Caldwell's eyes met Nora's, a flicker of something trust-desperation passing between them. "Don't," he said softly, the word barely audible. Nora's finger rested on the trigger, her heart a war drum. The sprinklers rained down the flames, dyeing the room a haze of smoke and fear. She had seconds to decide, seconds before Delta at the entrance made his move, before the sirens she could now hear in the distance arrived. The young woman in the corner whimpered, and Nora knew one thing with absolute certainty: she wasn't fighting for Caldwell or Lang. She was fighting for the innocent, for the girl she used to be. And she would not lose. The Crimson Orchid was a battlefield frozen in a moment of fragile stalemate, its once pristine elegance now a sodden ruin. The sprinklers had doused the fire Nora had ignited, leaving the dining room slick with water. The air heavy with the smell of charred wood, wet velvet, and the metallic tang of fear. Shattered glass from the burst vodka bottle glittered on the oak floor, reflecting the flickering chandeliers like scattered stars. The patrons remained huddled under tables, their faces pale, their breathing shallow, as if any sound might tip the balance toward catastrophe. Ethan Caldwell sat rigid at table 12, his hazel eyes locked on Nora, a mix of awe and calculation in his gaze. Gabriel Voss the Wraith stood over him, his Glock pressed against Caldwell's temple, his blonde hair dripping, his once impeccable suit clinging to his frame. The scout at the entrance, Delta, the last of Voss's men, held his position, his pistol sweeping the room, his eyes darting between Nora and the distant wail of sirens growing louder outside. Nora Kane stood 20 feet from Voss, the Beretta M9 steady in her hands, her black uniform soaked, but her stance unshaken. The silver bracelet on her wrist, engraved with control, felt like a burning brand, a reminder of Victor Lang, the man who had forged her into this weapon and now sent killers to her sanctuary. The young woman in the corner booth, her face streaked with tears, was a silent anchor, tethering Nora to a purpose beyond the chaos. This wasn't about Caldwell or Lang. It was about the innocents caught in their war. But the weight of Lang's name spoken by Voss had cracked something inside her, and the fault lines of her loyalty were beginning to show. Nora's mind was a razor slicing through the variables of the moment. 3 of Voss's men were down alpha unconscious by the bar. Bravo crumpled in the kitchen, Charlie clutching his bleeding thigh near the restrooms. Delta was the wild card, his position at the entrance giving him a clear shot if she made a wrong move. Voss was the fulcrum, his gun on Caldwell, his voice a low growl. "The Eclipse Key. Nora," he said, his obsidian eyes boring into hers. "You know what it is. You know what it can do. Lang needs it to finish what he started. Caldwell's playing God with it, and you're protecting the wrong man." Nora's grip on the Beretta tightened, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. She knew the Eclipse Key's reputation. Whispers in the dark corners of Chicago's tech world called it a skeleton key for the digital age, capable of cracking any network, any vault, any secret. In the wrong hands, it could topple economies, expose governments, or worse. Caldwell's voice cut through the tension, steady but strained. "He's lying, Miss Kane. Lang's not some savior. He wants to burn the system down, consequences be damned. I'm the one keeping it contained." Voss's laugh was a jagged blade. "Contained? You stole it, Ethan. You gutted Lang's company, his life's work, and called it collateral damage. You're no hero. You're a thief in a suit." The words landed like blows, each one chipping away at the foundation of Nora's world. Victor Lang had been her savior, the man who'd seen a broken 15-year-old and given her a path out of despair. After her brother Jamie's death, She'd been a ball of rage and grief, ready to burn herself out in the streets of Englewood. Lang had found her, funded the community center, paid for Sergeant Voss's brutal self-defense program. He'd given her the bracelet, his quiet voice promising, "Control is your power, Nora. Never let it go." But another memory flickered darker, buried deeper a night, when Lang had asked her to cross a line to plant evidence on arrival during one of his charitable operations. She'd refused, walked away, and buried that life. Now, standing in the wreckage of the Crimson Orchid, she wondered if she'd ever truly escaped him. Voss's words echoed that doubt, suggesting Lang was a visionary betrayed by Caldwell's greed. Yet Caldwell's calm certainty, his claim of protecting the world, rang with its own truth. Nora was caught between two titans, each claiming the moral high ground in a valley of lies. She needed time, and time was running out. The sirens were closer now, maybe a block away, their wail cutting through the rain. Delta shifted at the entrance, his pistol twitching, his nerves fraying. Voss's patience was thinning, his gun pressing harder against Caldwell's temple. "You're out of moves, Nora," he said, his voice low and taunting. "You're good, better than I expected, but you're one woman against me, and I've got the leverage." He nodded toward Caldwell. "Drop the gun or he's dead." Nora's eyes flicked to the ornate mirror behind the bar, its surface streaked with water, but still offering a distorted view of the room. She saw Delta's reflection, his posture tense, his focus split. She saw the young woman in the corner now, clutching her table's edge, her eyes pleading. Nora's heart pounded, but her mind was clear. She needed a distraction, a way to shift the balance without bloodshed. Her gaze landed on a control panel near the bar, a hidden security system she'd learned about during a late-night shift when the manager had drunkenly boasted about the restaurant's panic mode. It wasn't a fire alarm, but a silent alert that would lock the doors and flash a signal to the police. Risky, but it could buy her seconds. Nora took a slow step sideways, keeping the Beretta trained on Voss. "You don't want to do this, Gabriel," she said, her voice steady, buying time. "You know me. You know what I'm capable of. Walk away, and no one else gets hurt." Voss's smile was a thin slash. "You think you're Lang's equal? You're his shadow, Nora. A failed experiment. He trained me too, but I didn't run away like you did." The jab stung, but Nora didn't flinch. She edged closer to the bar, her movements deliberate, her eyes never leaving Voss. The patrons watched breathless, as if the room itself were holding its breath. She reached the control panel, her free hand brushing the edge of the bar fingers, finding the concealed button. She pressed it, and a soft click echoed barely audible over the rain. The front door's lock engaged with a faint thud, and a red light blinked in the corner of the room unnoticed by Voss, but enough to make Delta glance toward it, his focus breaking for a split second. That was her window. Nora dove behind the bar, using it as cover just as Delta fired. The suppressed shot cracked the bullet, grazing the bar's edge, sending splinters flying. Voss shouted, "Hold your fire, idiot!" But the damage was done. Delta's shot had drawn his attention, giving Nora a heartbeat to move. She scrambled to the kitchen doors, bursting through them into the stainless steel chaos. The air was still warm, the smell of seared meat and garlic now mixed with the faint ozone of her earlier Molotov cocktail. The back door to the alley was ajar, the staff long gone, rain blowing in. Nora crouched by a prep counter, her breath controlled, her mind racing. Voss would come for her. He had to. He couldn't afford to let her control the board. She heard his footsteps, deliberate and soft, approaching the kitchen doors. Delta's heavier tread followed the two men, moving as a unit. Nora's eyes scanned the kitchen landing on a heavy rolling pin, its wood worn but solid. She grabbed it, tucking the Beretta into her waistband. Guns were loud, predictable. She needed surprise. The doors swung open, and Voss stepped in his Glock, sweeping the space. Delta was behind him, his pistol raised, his eyes darting nervously. "She's here," Voss hissed, his voice low. "Find her." Nora waited, her body pressed against the counter, her breathing slow and silent. She listened to their footsteps, tracking their positions. Voss moved left toward the stoves. Delta went right toward the walk-in fridge. She saw her chance. She hurled the rolling pin at Delta's legs, the wood spinning through the air. It struck his shin, and he grunted, stumbling his pistol, firing wildly into the ceiling. Plaster dust rained down, and Voss spun toward the sound, his focus split. Nora exploded from her crouch, tackling Voss before he could re-aim. They crashed into a rack of pots, the clatter deafening. Voss was fast, his training matching hers, but Nora was relentless. She drove her knee into his stomach, knocking the wind from him, then slammed the heel of her hand into his jaw. He staggered, his Glock slipping from his grip. Delta recovered, raising his pistol, but Nora was faster. She grabbed a metal mixing bowl and threw it, catching him in the face. He yelped, blood streaming from his nose, and she closed the distance, disarming him with a sharp twist to his wrist. He collapsed, clutching his hand, and Nora kicked his gun across the tiles. 4 down. She stood over Voss, the Beretta back in her hand, her chest heaving. He was on his knees, blood trickling from his lip, his eyes burning with rage and something else, recognition. "You're still Lang's," he rasped. "You can't betray him." Nora's jaw clenched, the bracelet, a weight she could no longer ignore. "What does he want with the Eclipse key?" she demanded, her voice cold. Voss coughed a pained laugh. "To fix the world. To tear down parasites like Caldwell who hoard power while people like you and me bleed for it." Nora's eyes flicked to Caldwell, still seated, watching her through the open kitchen doors. His face was unreadable, but his voice carried. "He's manipulating you, Miss Kane. Lang's vision is chaos. The Eclipse key in his hands would crash every system it touches. Banks, governments, lives. I'm the only one who can keep it safe." Nora's mind reeled. Lang, the man who'd saved her, was now the architect of this violence. Caldwell, the corporate titan, claimed to be the world's protector. Both men were liars in their own way, but the truth was buried in the Eclipse key, and she was the only one who could control it. The sirens were deafening now, red and blue lights flashing through the shattered windows. Nora made her decision. She stepped closer to Voss, her voice low and unyielding. "Tell Lang the Eclipse key is mine now. I'm the third party. If he or Caldwell makes a move against anyone in this room again, I'll burn their worlds down." Voss stared at her, his defiance crumbling under the weight of her conviction. She didn't have the key yet, but he didn't know that. Her bluff was a weapon, and she wielded it like a blade. She turned to Caldwell, her eyes locking onto his. "Give it to me," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Caldwell hesitated, then reached into his jacket, pulling out a small obsidian-black device shaped like a crescent moon. He tossed it to her, and she caught it, the cold metal heavy in her hand. The Eclipse key. The room seemed to pulse with its presence, a Pandora's box of power now in her control. Nora stepped back into the dining room, the Beretta still in her hand, the key in her pocket. The patrons watched her, their fear now mixed with awe. The young woman in the corner met her gaze, and Nora saw something new in her eyes, not just fear, but hope. The police burst through the door, their shouts filling the air. "NYPD, drop the weapon." Nora raised her hand, slowly placing the Beretta on a table. Her fist closed around the Eclipse key. Voss was still on his knees, Delta groaning beside him. Caldwell stood, his voice taking charge, spinning a story of a botched robbery and a heroic bartender. But Nora knew the truth. She hadn't chosen a side, she'd created one. She was no longer Lang's disciple or Caldwell's savior. She was the fulcrum, the line between loyalty and betrayal, and the power she held could reshape the game entirely. The rain had stopped, but Chicago's skyline glittered with a wet, restless sheen under the sodium glow of streetlights. It was a week after the chaos at the Crimson Orchid, and the city had already begun to paper over the incident with the efficiency of a machine that thrived on forgetting. The official story, spun by Ethan Caldwell's army of lawyers and publicists, was a tidy narrative of a thwarted robbery with Nora Kane cast as the unlikely heroine, a bartender with a knack for self-defense who'd saved a billionaire and his fellow patrons. The truth, buried beneath non-disclosure agreements and sealed police reports, was far messier. Nora stood now in a glass-walled office at the pinnacle of Nexus Corp's headquarters, a sleek monolith of steel and reflective blue that pierced the Chicago skyline like a blade. The office was a study in calculated minimalism, a single ebony desk, a wall of screens displaying real-time data from markets across the globe, and a floor-to-ceiling window that framed the city as if it were Caldwell's personal chessboard. He stood by that window, his navy suit immaculate, his hazel eyes fixed on the sprawl below. Nora, dressed not in her bartender's uniform, but in a tailored charcoal blazer and slacks, felt the weight of the Eclipse key in her pocket, a crescent-shaped device that pulsed with the potential to upend the world. The silver bracelet on her wrist, engraved with control, lay discarded on her apartment counter, a relic of a past she was no longer bound to. She was here to redefine her future, but on her terms. The aftermath of the Crimson Orchid had been a whirlwind of controlled chaos. The police had swarmed the restaurant, cuffing Gabriel Voss and his surviving men, their faces a mix of pain and disbelief as they were dragged away. Nora had stood silent. The Beretta surrendered the Eclipse key hidden in her fist, her expression unreadable as Caldwell wove his story for the detectives. He'd painted her as a brave civilian, a narrative that kept her out of a cell, but also kept her in his debt. The press had eaten it up, splashing her name across headlines, "Heroic bartender saves tech mogul," but Nora had avoided the spotlight, slipping back into the shadows where she thrived. The young woman from the corner booth, whose terrified face had anchored Nora's resolve, had found her after the police cleared the scene, pressing a trembling thank you into her hand. A note scrawled with a phone number and the words, "You gave me courage." That note was tucked in Nora's wallet now, a reminder of why she'd fought not for Caldwell, not for Victor Lang, but for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Caldwell turned from the window, his gaze settling on Nora with the intensity of a man who read people like balance sheets. "Miss Kane," he said, his voice smooth, but carrying the weight of command. "I owe you a debt that money can't repay, though you'll find a substantial sum in a private account, enough to give you freedom to live as you choose." He paused, his eyes narrowing, assessing her as if she were a puzzle he hadn't yet solved. "But I didn't bring you here for gratitude. I'm not offering you a job as a bodyguard. Bodyguards react. You act. You see threats before they form, and you neutralize them before they strike. My empire," he gestured to the city below, "has enemies in every corner. Corporate rivals, foreign governments, men like Victor Lang, who'd burn it all down for their own ideals. I need a new division, one that operates in the gray spaces where boardrooms and battlefields meet. Your division. You'll build it, answer only to me, and your mandate will be to stop threats before they have names." Nora stood still, her face a mask of calm, but her mind was a storm. The offer was a throne in the shadows, a chance to wield power most could only dream of. But it was also a leash, tying her to a man whose world was built on control. She'd spent years fighting to claim for herself. The eclipse key in her pocket felt heavier, a black hole of potential that could destroy or protect, depending on who held it. She thought of Lang, the man who'd saved her from a life of despair, who'd given her the skills that had turned the Crimson Orchid into her battlefield. Voss's words echoed in her memory. Lang wants to fix the world. But Lang had sent killers to her sanctuary, had used her past to justify his war. Caldwell, for all his polished arrogance, had trusted her with the key, an act of either insane faith or ruthless calculation. Both men saw her as a tool, but she was no one's weapon. Not anymore. "I accept," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the silence of the office. Caldwell's eyebrow arched a flicker of surprise, breaking his composure. "But on two conditions." He leaned against his desk, folding his arms, intrigued. "Go on." Nora stepped forward, her eyes locked on his, her presence filling the room. "First, Victor Lang is off-limits. No retaliation, no moves against him from you or Nexus Corp. The stalemate I created holds. He stays out of your way, and you let him live." Caldwell's jaw tightened, his mind clearly weighing the cost of sparing his enemy. Lang was a ghost in the tech world, a man whose charitable facade hid a relentless ambition to dismantle the systems Caldwell dominated. But Nora's gaze was unyielding, and after a long moment, Caldwell gave a sharp nod. "Done." And the second, Nora reached into her pocket, pulling out the eclipse key. Its obsidian surface caught the light, a crescent moon that seemed to hum with secrets. "I keep this," she said, holding it up. "It's not yours, and it's not Lang's. It's mine. My leverage to ensure your necessary actions don't cross lines I'm unwilling to defend." The room went still, the air charged with the audacity of her demand. Caldwell's eyes widened, a rare crack in his armor. But then a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. Not the smile of a predator, but of a man who'd met his match. "You're not just a soldier, Miss Kane," he said, his voice low with respect. "You're a strategist." He extended his hand. "Welcome to Nexus Corp." Nora took his hand, her grip firm, sealing a contract that was as much a challenge as a partnership. She wasn't joining his empire, she was carving out her own. As their hands clasped, her mind flashed to the eclipse key, its secrets still locked away. That night, back in her sparse apartment, she'd connected it to a secure laptop, its interface revealing fragments of code that hinted at a project far larger than either Caldwell or Lang had admitted, a network of surveillance, a digital panopticon that could monitor or manipulate global systems. Lang's vision, perhaps, but twisted by Caldwell's ambition. There was a file labeled Apex Protocol password protected and a single word in its metadata, Jamie. Her brother's name. The coincidence, or was it sent a shiver through her, a reminder that the key was more than a weapon? It was a map to truths she hadn't yet uncovered. She released Caldwell's hand and stepped back, her expression unreadable. "I'll need resources," she said. "A team I choose, a budget with no strings, and access to your intelligence networks." Caldwell nodded, already anticipating her demands. "You'll have it. Start tomorrow. Pick your people, build your fortress. The gray spaces are yours." Nora turned to leave, but paused at the door, glancing back. "One more thing. If I find out you're lying about the key or Lang, I won't just walk away. I'll dismantle you." Caldwell's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened, acknowledging the threat. "Noted," he said simply. That night, Nora stood on the roof of her apartment building in Pilsen, the Chicago skyline, a jagged silhouette against the starless sky. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of Lake Michigan and the distant hum of the city that never slept. She held the eclipse key in her hand, its weight, a promise, and a burden. The bracelet was gone, left behind like a shed skin. She wasn't Lang's disciple or Caldwell's enforcer. She was something new, a force neither man could predict or control. The note from the young woman at the Crimson Orchid was in her pocket, a talisman of her purpose. She thought of Jamie of the community center where Lang had found her of the blood and sweat she'd spilled to become the woman standing here now. The Apex Protocol loomed in her mind, a mystery tied to her brother's name, a thread she would pull until it unraveled. Nora slipped the key back into her pocket and looked out over the city. Chicago was a chessboard, and she was no longer a pawn. She was a queen, moving in the shadows, guarding the line between protection and ambition. Tomorrow, she would begin building her team, her network, her kingdom. She would dig into the eclipse key, uncover Lang's secrets, and hold Caldwell to his word. The war between titans wasn't over. It was just beginning, and Nora Kane was its new architect. As the wind whipped her hair, she felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years, purpose. Not the borrowed purpose of Lang's ideals or Caldwell's empire, but her own. She was the silent blade forged in pain, tempered by loss, and now ready to carve her own path through the chaos.